All right. Has everybody joined us? It's a little past 4. See, people are being added at a rapid pace. All right, so it's 4:01, so let's get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Anjan Thakur, interim dean of the Olin Business School, and I'm really thrilled to welcome all of you to today's Leadership Perspectives event. Thank you all for joining us. We're proud to bring you the Leadership Perspective series, which has illuminating discussions with an impressive lineup of speakers from various perspectives. We believe that events like this make a meaningful contribution to producing insights and bringing you to the gateway of ideas, innovation, and inspiration. Today, we'll take a full circle look at entrepreneurship. Our conversation will cover multiple perspectives, including an insider's view of a startup taking an idea from inception to creation to market. We'll also get firsthand insights into the other key ingredients in entrepreneurship, namely venture capital. And we'll touch on strategies for aspiring entrepreneurs. All these perspectives are going to come to you from just one person who has spent the last decade working in the entrepreneurship space. It's a real honor to have alumnus Ray Colletti with us this afternoon. In just a moment, Ray and Olin professor Rebecca Dohrman will begin a discussion on the ins and outs of entrepreneurship, after which they'll answer a few questions. Please send your questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. They'll answer as many questions as they can in the time that we have. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker, Raymond Ray Colletti. Ray is a proud Olin alumnus. He earned his bachelor's degree in marketing and political science, and he graduated in 2009. After he graduated, Ray began as an early employee on the business and go-to-market side of 2 successful New York City tech companies, Datadog and AppNexus. Both companies flourished while he was there. AppNexus was ultimately acquired by AT&T. After that, Ray moved on to become Vice President of Revenue at CodeCov, a leading code coverage reporting solution. Today, Ray is a founder of the investment group Zag Capital. He's an active philanthropist and also an angel investor. Zag Capital focuses on early stage tech startups, particularly in the business-to-business space. Zag Capital has been involved with several WashU ventures as well. So I'm going to take this opportunity to thank Ray for his tremendous support of WashU and Olin. Next, I would like to introduce our moderator, Rebecca Dohrman. Rebecca is a senior lecturer in management communication at WashU Olin. Her research and teaching interests center on how to meaningfully integrate new technologies into modern organizations and the socialization process of young people into high-tech fields. She has an impressive list of degrees and credentials, a Bachelor of Arts in Spanish and International Studies, an MS in Communication from SLU, and then MS in Software Development from Maryville, and a PhD in Organization Communication. So she's been really busy with all of the knowledge acquisition that she's been engaged in. And she's currently working on a GIS certificate from University College, U College at Washington University. So Rebecca also consults with a focus on local initiatives to improve computing programs in elementary and middle schools, to increase engagement with and confidence in young people and high-tech career tracks. So it's a very worthwhile venture. We know that you have to begin to work on young minds early before they get to college. So Ray and Rebecca, we're honored to have you both with us here today. I want to thank both of you. We're excited about your discussion. And so without further delay, I'm going to hand it over to Rebecca to begin the conversation. Please take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Really appreciate it. And truly a joy to be here with you, Ray, and to see you again. And I'm looking forward myself to this hour and the chance to hear some of your insights and hear more of your story and some of the tips that you'll share and some of the things that we'll hear. So really looking forward to it. Thanks for being with us today. So I want to begin by hearing a bit about the first position that you took after you left your years as a student here at Olin. Your biography is incredibly impressive. I have no doubt that we have some undergraduate students here in the audience, maybe even some graduate students who are thinking, how did he do all of these things since he was in our shoes in 2009 as an Olin undergrad? So I'd love to start by hearing a bit about your first steps after Olin.
Yeah, absolutely. And first, let me say thank you, Rebecca, for joining this conversation and asking fun questions. And thank you to Amy and team at Olin for helping organize all of this. And of course, Dean Thacker for the kind introductions at the top there. As the resume gets longer and you're further out of college, you start to take the very first ones off. And there's some really important stuff in the first 2 years post Olin. And the first job, so I graduated in 2009, and as many of you know, the economy was not good then. The anecdotal data point that I like to give is that Deloitte hired, I think, 40 people out of the class of 2008, and they hired 2 people out of the class 2009 from WashU. And so didn't really matter how good your grades were. If you weren't really truly the top of the class, a lot of the jobs that were available to prior classes were not available to us. So I actually applied to the National Park Service. So I spent it was an internship in risk management at a park actually based in Virginia. So nothing tech oriented there.
Mm-hmm. I love that though, because I mean, I think it just speaks to the layers and the different paths that things take. And I think that's really instructive for the students. So you started at the National Park Service at the time. What were you imagining kind of that your path would look like? What were you imagining that you might be doing 10 years later? I mean, could you have ever, were you still thinking that you'd move into this space, or where did you go from there? Question. I guess is my question. Yeah.
And I think that the lens to say was, I knew directionally that I wanted to have a job where I could have a high amount of autonomy and where I could learn a ton. And looking across a number of industries and what was available, and also where I could frankly get my foot in the door and start a conversation with a potential employer. Startups were top of the list. And they also, once you were not an intern, you came with equity, which was also very attractive to me at the time to kind of understand how I thought about companies and potential career trajectory. So there was definitely not a zoomed out master plan for getting here to where I am today. The next step was actually applying cold to a large number of startups in New York City. And the first startup I joined actually failed after 10 months. So it was another kind of step forward, step back situation in those very early years that generally don't show up on the resume or in the intros.
But they form you, right? Early on, they form kind of your sense of character, your sense of kind of tolerance for risk, maybe even. Would you say that those early experiences form some of that for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the risk tolerance and risk is a thing I talk about a lot. And just to be clear, when I'm talking about risk, I'm almost always talking about financial risk. I'm not talking about bungee jumping or other sorts of existential risk. I'm talking about financial risk. The risk equation was changed in 2009. because there weren't a lot of jobs available, and the expectation was totally different about what that graduating class was going to be doing in the next 9 months. And so I think that I was able to turn the dial on that. And I actually think, and we'll talk about this much later, but knowing what I know now, it's a great time to be trying to start your own thing, or 2 or 3 students getting together to work on something. It's an awesome time for that. I think, again, maybe not as dramatically so as it was in 2009, but it's never a bad time for it, but I think it's especially a good time now. And the other thing I'll add when it comes to that, to your point, the phrase might be overstating a little bit, but it's a how you do anything is how you do everything sort of attitude. And as soon as I was in the workplace, as soon as I was actually in a startup, which again failed after 10 months, so let's not paint the prettiest picture here. I was showing up early, I was leaving late, I was trying to figure out how I could be helpful wherever I could be helpful, because I was an intern, I was getting $20 an hour. It was not any sort of glamorous job at that point in time. But as that startup collapsed, the New York City tech ecosystem was pretty small at the time. It still isn't huge, but it's significantly larger. And people from that company went to join AppNexus, which was then the next company that I joined, where I worked for 2.5 years. I was the 40th employee when I got there. I left them as 500 people 2.5 years later. And it was an absolutely transformative experience for my career.
Tell me a little bit more about how you made the decision to join AppNexus, or how you transitioned there. Was it a connection, or how did you make that decision to join them?
Yeah, the simplest framework is that a few things would happen. One, to the earlier part of the conversation, I was optimizing for how much I could learn. I looked around the room and there were incredibly smart people. I was optimizing to have equity and to be at a place that I thought was going to be high growth. And lastly, I was looking at the other offers that I had available, and they either weren't opportunities where I felt I was going to learn a ton, or I didn't feel like it was going to be as high growth. And I found it through the people that I've been working with at the company that failed. So it was a direct line through of doing work in one place and then getting pulled into the next. And I think that it's probably true in undergrad. If you do a project with someone and you think that they work incredibly hard and you work well together, you'd be excited to do another project with them. Spoiler alert, like that's your whole career. If you're working with someone great, you're gonna want to work with them. And I see it play out across tech companies all the time and elsewhere, other industries too.
Yeah, I often tell students, nothing magically changes on graduation day. Whatever the habits and the things you've been doing on teams, and the work sort of characteristics, or the methods of working. I think you said it, how you do anything is how you do everything. The discipline and the methods that they're building early on in their courses do translate right into those early career experiences, which then translate into the later career experiences. You mentioned community and the New York sort of tech startup community, and that the people at that first startup then transitioned with you to AppNexus. I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to how did you build that community in that first startup? I'm imagining if it failed, that it was in some ways a challenging environment, and yet it seems like you were able to sort of successfully build community. I'm just curious if you could speak to community and how you built that early in your career.
Yeah, I think fundamentally is a willingness to do work and to be assigned things that might have been out of scope, and then step in and take action. And I've always carried with me. I think most entrepreneurs carry that with them, because if you're going to be starting something at the early stages, you're going to be doing a lot of jobs that you didn't think that you were going to do, and you probably don't want to do, and you might not even be good at, but there's no one else doing them, so you're going to be doing them for a little bit. And that's definitely an experience I had early in my career, even though I was not the founder of those companies, but it was a situation in which there was always more to be done. The scope was always wider than what we could get to, and widening, which is an exciting place to be, but for some people that's too stressful. So again, I feel like the people who are probably watching this webinar are self-selecting in more towards that, but again, it's not for everyone.
Oh, that's a great point. Okay, so you were at AppNexus and about 2.5 years, if I remember correctly. And then at some point you transitioned to Datadog. Can you tell me a little bit about that transition? I know you were there for several years. So I'm curious to hear about the work you did there.
Yeah. One of the signs of a strong tech company, and strong is not always good or bad. There can be strong in a bad way, but when you leave a good, like a strong tech company, there's going to be a feeling like you're leaving behind friends and family. It is a very intense feeling, and the way that I phrased this then, because it was a long time ago for me, so it was close to this experience. But there are no graduation dates in life, and sometimes you have to graduate yourself, and it's really scary to graduate. So professionally speaking, I had felt that the learning curve was slowing down at AppNexus, and I was looking around at the roles that were available, and I couldn't see myself being happy in those roles 18 months from then. And so I decided I actually realized this almost a year before I left. I did a web development immersive to get a bit more technical. And then after doing the web development immersive, started applying to tech startups in a blended business and technical role, and ended up applying to and getting accepted to Datadog. And there's a ton of luck involved in this. So we'll just mention it there, and we can come back to it later if it comes up in the questions. But this is all to say that I realized that one of the earliest reasons why I did join AppNexus, the learning curve was different, and I wanted to go back to the steep part of the curve. That's where I was hungry for. And also, a company that's 500 people and a company that's 40 people, vastly different companies. And when I joined Datadog, it was a much, much smaller company. So I was getting that part of the experience on the high level autonomy again.
Again, you've mentioned that high growth phrase, and I remember you gave me that phrase, optimizing for short-term learning, and that idea, like consistently early in your career, those were the opportunities that you sought out, trying to just grow. And I love that, kind of in opposition to what you mentioned earlier, that there wasn't really a master plan, but it strikes me that there was a plan, which is to grow quickly in the short term, knowing and sort of having always the confidence that you would be able to sense and have sort of self-awareness about when it would be time to graduate yourself, as you said, and then transition to the next thing. But you did stay at Datadog for several years. And so it seemed like there was a lot of growth there. Or would you say that was a pretty transformative experience for you in terms of your learning curve?
Absolutely, yes. But let me add one thing in for all attendees. Just, I think it's good specific definition, which is that short term, when I think about this in a career sense, it's around 18 months. So you shouldn't take a job for 3 months, think you're bored, and then YOLO into Web3 and get out of there. Like that's not the exact lens. There might be a place and time for that, but just to be clear, like I think that you have to be involved in an organization for a little bit to see how you fit, to learn the way they do things, to learn about the customers and what potential growth could look like. But to answer your question, okay, yes, I was there for 5 years. It was absolutely transformative. While I was at Datadog, I was learning so much all the time. And I think that Datadog, if it was half the size or a quarter of the size it was now, I'd probably have a similar transformative experience. But if you find a company that is growing really, really quickly, if you want to become a deep subject matter expert in one specific thing, you can go down that thing and it will broaden, grow, and change for a number of years. There are people who started at Datadog when I did, and they're there 10 years later, and they still have interesting problems to work on. And it's truly incredible. And for me personally, I was trying to optimize to learn as much as possible about the business side of the organization. And so I started in support engineering, which is client-facing technical support. I led that team for a little bit. Then I went to account executive, where I was doing full-time sales. And then I left that to go to be a customer success person, to understand how existing customer relationships learn the evolution of how they think about the product as it grows inside of an organization, and then all the way to the enterprise. And so it was a full gamut of experience across the client-facing side of the business.
See, and it's such a broad range of experiences. And I'm struck that all sort of happened, while I'm sure it felt like it was happening quickly and slowly all at the same time, just in a matter of a decade or so. It all kind of would you say sort of served the foundation then of you founding Zag Capital eventually? That the experiences and the lessons and the community that you built. I'd love to hear the story of kind of how you then made that decision, or how it came to be that Zag Capital exists.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in a similar lens on the learning side, but now on the opportunity side.
Mhm.
So yes, after spending 10 years in New York City tech, I knew a lot of people who were either starting companies or knew someone who was going to start a company. And again, on the resume shortening side, I also briefly worked for a venture capital firm after Datadog. So I went to go sit on the other side of the table, so to speak, to see how partner meetings run. It's a great seed stage fund in New York called Primary Ventures. So I was there for only a little bit, and I realized mutually wasn't a fit, and that's okay. But I'd always been interested in investing. I'd done a little bit of angel investing previously, and over time I realized I knew a lot of people in my network who were incredibly smart, and that was from the community. And then this other interesting thing started to happen as Datadog grew and became a better and better known name, especially in the B2B SaaS community. Software as a service, business to business. It's a developer tool. I maybe could talk a little bit about that later if there are questions on it. But as it became better known, people were seeking me out for guidance. They were seeking me out for information on what we saw, what we did that led the company to be so successful, playbooks, if you will. So it was twofold, right? It's one, just a natural community that can start to exist if you're in a space for 10 years and you're outgoing and you're willing to participate. And the second thing is again the success of Datadog, and then being known for being involved in that company. And I'll add one thing. I definitely want to give the early employees at AppNexus. It was an advertising technology company. That was when I joined in 2010. I want to give them a shout out. They hired incredibly well. They managed to pull entrepreneurial people who had never been entrepreneurs into the company, from banks, from consulting, from all over the place. And I'm still in touch with people that I was working with there 10 years ago. And there have been, I don't know, there have probably been 20 companies founded out of that. And at least one of them has an exit that's north of $1 billion. And by the way, that's the first 500 employees. That's not including anyone that came afterwards, which, is there too.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I'm curious. I know one of the things that some audience members are interested in is, as you sit in your current seat, and thank you for kind of helping us walk through that narrative of kind of the foundation of your career. I think it's helpful. And I'll mention to the audience, if you have questions, you're welcome to put them in chat, and we can take questions either throughout the conversation, or we can take them at the end. But I'm curious, I know one thing that is on people's mind is as you sit in your seat at Zag Capital, how do you make decisions about what kinds of companies to add to your portfolio, or how do you sort of make those decisions about next steps with the capital?
Yeah, absolutely. It's, how long do we have? We got like 6 hours to talk about this. Okay, great.
We have
So
approximately 6 hours. Yeah.
I first want to talk about venture capital at a high level, and especially people who are thinking about going out and raising money.
Mm-hmm.
You have to know your audience. And so most venture capital, and better than your audience, know your audience and their incentive structures. So there's a lot written about this online. I'm not going to go too long form on it. In short, most venture capital firms are going to be specialized. They're going to have what they frequently refer to as a thesis, and they're going to be seeking companies that fit that thesis. And it's stage specific. It can be geo specific, but it's almost always thesis specific. And the reason why they do that is because venture capital funds get their money from LPs, and LPs are seeking diversification in venture or they agree with the specific thesis that a fund has. And that's like the whole arc that exists. I could say a lot more on the LP side too, but I'll refrain from now. This is all to say that what we do is not what is common in the market, because we are less thesis specific. We're looking for incredible founders, generally speaking, at the earliest stage, and we're happy to be brainstorm partners. So a lot of times when entrepreneurs approach venture capitalists, they think to themselves, I have one shot. When I ask for the meeting, I have to be ready to pitch. I have to have my idea perfect. We don't function that way. We're happy to get pitched, but at the same time, what we prefer in a lot of senses, especially if a company is pre-product or pre-revenue, we want to be, we worked in tech startups for 10 years. I say we, because I have two partners at Zag Capital, and we worked in startups for 10 years. We have a lot of thoughts, and we're happy to take a second call and a third call. And again, this ties back to the learning attribute from before. The thing that we index on the most is not what you know, you being you, a founder, and you in the royal sense here, not what you know or not what you've done, but the rate at which you learn. Because if you're going, everything is changing, the markets are changing, business is changing, and you as an entrepreneur are trying to make change. And so if you're demonstrating the ability to ingest new information, make a decision that, and then show, especially in a data-oriented way, that you ingested the information correctly and made the correct call on the other side, it's extraordinarily impressive to us. So I don't think that's unique for us, but I do think it's worth saying that a lot of times it's a mistake to just think, okay, I've done these 6 things, I know these 4 things, and I'm good to go.
Fascinating. That's a really important commentary too about kind of developing those habits of mind. You know, I'm thinking still about what you said earlier, how you do anything is how you do everything. And that sounds like that's also part of how you're evaluating founders or potential companies. So very interesting. I want to pause for just a minute. We have a couple poll everywhere questions that we want to hear from the audience. And I know we got a couple of questions that came in too, but I want to put up the first question so we can get a sense from the audience about who is here. I know that you're all here because you have some interest in startups, but we're curious if you've already been working as an entrepreneur for many years, or if you're just beginning full-time work, maybe you're a part-time startup founder. So if you want to scan the QR code, or you can also join by web or text, and then answer this question by typing in the letter that's at the end of the answer that sort of fits you. And we'll leave the instructions up there, and I'll give Ray his next question, and then we'll touch back on the results. So Ray, next question. I'm curious, when we think about entrepreneurs who are getting started, what would you say is the most important thing or things for them to either do or sort of develop in terms of their skill set or in terms of their habits of mind?
Wow. Skill set.
I know, I asked tough questions, you know.
Skill set or habits of mind.
That's right.
So I'm going to address this at a few different stages.
Okay.
If you're in the ideation stage, being curious about your customer and how they actually are currently living and doing the job they do, so that when you, and by job be relative here, like you could be building an app for someone that's, you know, B2C or sorry, D2C or something, but I still want you to think about that as a job, right? Even if you're building a game, it's still a job. The job that the game does is it relieves stress and they have fun, hopefully. But again, a loose sense. So what is the job that they're currently doing and that you will now be a part of? And I think having a huge client here, again, very loose term, vision and lens on whatever you're trying to achieve is going to make you incredibly informed as you decide to start building whatever it is you build. And I want to give some credit there to I think his name is Steve Blank, who wrote 4 Steps to the Epiphany, and then there's Minimum Viable Product MVP, Eric Reese, I believe his name is, and the last one that I mentioned is Y Combinator, who the Y Combinator interviews are so customer centric. They want to know that you know everything about your customer. So I think that's one of the even in the pre-building stage, which is a great lens for people to have about what will impress a venture capitalist or a future customer, frankly, as they start to build. Also, lawyers, get a lawyer and make sure that if you're going to form anything, you sign paperwork and you and your co-founders have the equity you think you do. Run the process, do the thing. They're not cheap. It is worth paying them. So
that's great. I mean, that's a great Great tip. All right, so let's go ahead and see who is in the audience. If we could put up the results from this question. Excellent. So good. Okay. So we have people that are interested either in learning more or considering startup work in the future. Perfect. And then several people who are working part-time.
What a distribution. Can we just leave that up for a second?
Absolutely.
Wow. So, okay. So no A or B, all C, D, E. Okay. This is great. Well, I'd also just like to thank everyone who answered the poll, because I don't know, I frequently ignore polls. So I'm delighted that people answered.
No, and I think it's helpful. There's one more question I put up with the poll everywhere, and then I'll ask Ray another question, which I think will be really helpful, especially given these poll results. So the second question I have for the audience is what comes to mind when you hear the word startup. So this is a word cloud. You can just text in a phrase or a word or a couple of words that come to mind when you hear the word startup, since that's what our focus is today. Ray, my next question for you, while people are populating the word cloud, is one thing I'd love to hear a bit about, and knowing that we have many people that are interested in working in startups in the future, is what resources you use to keep your ear to the ground, so to speak. What do you recommend that others listen to or read to sort of stay on top of trends in the startup space?
Yeah, I would just like to point out that there's such a wealth of free knowledge on these things that what I spent, I'll say, 4.5 years learning by making egregious mistakes that impacted my financial well-being. Most people who are in college or around that age who are thinking about working these things, if they're willing to give it the time to listen and read and learn, you're going to know 85% what I know, and it's not going to have cost you anything. So what resources, if you're thinking about working in a startup? So I think there are a few lenses on this. Mm-hmm. The first one I want to give is their free newsletters. One is called Axios Pro Rata. It's a venture capital newsletter. Another one is called Strictly VC. And if you sign up for those two, you're going to see all companies that have raised money. And they also frequently name all the venture capitalists that put the money into those companies. Oh. And I call these two out because it's kind of like seeing the ocean if you're a surfer. You're not actually surfing, but you're kind of getting a sense of, I'll pick a trend right now. Okay. A lot of venture capital money it always has been flowing into AI, but significantly more since ChatGPT came out and sure, what's happening with OpenAI and Microsoft. So if you're thinking about working for a startup, it never hurts to work for a well-capitalized startup. And these newsletters are frequently going to give a blurb on what the company does too. So you can not exactly be skimming it as a job site, but it's a good way to both see what's happening and then see at the same time those things. What were you going to say,
really
Rebecca?
Smart. No, that's really smart. I never thought about reading those newsletters as a way to almost think about it as a sort of job board. That's interesting.
Yeah, and you can't do this one for one, but there are venture capital firms that have a great reputation, and if you see them back a company, it does not always mean that it is guaranteed, but it means that there is, generally speaking, a decent amount of diligence about who the founders are and what they're up to. Again, that wasn't true of FTX. That isn't true of Andreessen's crypto fund. No hard feelings. If I think Andreessen is incredible anyway, so I'm just giving an example of where it's not always true.
Sure.
So this is all to say, getting a lens on what those funds are choosing to invest in can help inform which companies you decide to join potentially. I think there are so many other resources. There's a book called Venture Deals by Brad Feld. If you read that, you're going to know how you're going to, again, I talked earlier about understanding incentive structures. You're going to have a robust understanding of the incentive structures at play for any startup you might join, because you're going to know how they think about equity, what an employee equity option pool is. There's a podcast I love. There's so many podcasts I love. It's hard to pick one, but the one I want to pick is called Acquired. And they do talk about venture capital and they talk about a number of startups, but they talk about the business side of so many different things. They talk about everything from the Taylor Swift's business to the NFL and any other tech company you can imagine in between. They do TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductors. So they cover a really wide gamut, in depth, with a structural lens on it too. And they tell the narrative story. So I don't think it's boring, but it does put people to sleep, I know too. So no guarantees.
No, it's great. I wrote that down. I'm gonna look that one up. I have not seen that. Thank you. That's excellent. All right, let's go ahead and look at the results from the audience of the word cloud. What comes to mind when you hear the word startup? So this is kind of what's in our audience's mind. Interesting. Capital, funding, innovation. Ooh, excitement.
This is great, but we should talk about, I think, Rebecca, you tell me I'm wrong, I think we should talk about the negative ones. I think we should talk about broke. I think we should talk about broke and failure and risky.
I love it. I think that's a fantastic idea.
Because I think the big words here are correct.
Ooh, screenshot. I like this.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, it's great. And I don't think anything is wrong here, but I think that it's important to address some of these other aspects.
It's difficult. It's not all sort of it's not all glamorous, I'm sure you would say. Talk to me a little bit about kind of, as soon as that came up there, you immediately sort of probably were glad to see it at least a little bit, right? That there were some different layers and depth to it. But what lesson do you think is important for the audience to take away from that?
The first thing I want to say is that it shouldn't be awful. There are people that I know who I talk to people who work at startups all the time. I talk to founders all the time. And there are people who I have spoken to who are who are acquaintances who are describing an awful experience working at a tech startup. They're up till 2 a.m. Customers are yelling at them. It happens like this once a week where one of the founders changes their product direction. And they don't know what they're doing. And I'm here to say it doesn't have to be like that. And frankly, it shouldn't be like that. And that is probably a sign you're at the wrong place. And I'm not saying it won't be hard. Like, there are things that are going to be hard and should not be awful, I think is I'm going to come back to that phrasing of this thing. So yeah, there's absolutely a huge amount of risk. And I think depending on what your draws are, the de-risking function that a lot of people do, I think it still fits, is you go work at a big tech company for 2 years and then you go work at a small one. I don't know. I think that as we've seen in this current economy, everyone was doing layoffs. So I don't personally think that the nexus of risk is different. I think that people's understanding of risk is different. My friends who have been at big companies don't have a robust lens on who or why people got fired. And I think at some companies it was structural, and some companies it was random, like truly random. If you're in a small company, you know how much money's in the bank, and you know how long the company can exist. Not always, and maybe you don't get that information if you're an intern. But if you're making friends with people that work there and you're talking to them about it, you're going to have insight into actually what the trajectory of the company looks like. And if there's 10, 50, even 100 people, if you close a big sales deal, a big new deal, you're going to know, and you're going to think to yourself, okay, this company has momentum, it has traction, people find our product valuable. And I think that is a de-risking, a meta de-risking. Like, it's nice to be excited about a deal closing in and of itself and a new client being happy, but I think you can also say to yourself, okay, this is a real thing. So shouldn't be awful, and take the context clues to understand the risk that you're actually getting.
That transparency that you mentioned, like seeing the direct line between a big sales deal closing and knowing how it's going to affect the transparency into that at a smaller place, is a very interesting thing to consider. Well, thank you all for contributing to the word cloud. That's really interesting. And I appreciate that you drew out some of those, some of the different layers of it. I think it's good. as I was pondering some of the questions that I wanted to ask you, I was struck that this series is called Leadership Perspectives. And so as you founded Zag Capital, I'm curious to hear more about the culture that you have intentionally tried to create there. How has your leadership style come into view as part of this experience founding your company? And how would you say that it's evolved over the past couple of years?
Yeah, we're still so early. I wish I could answer that question 5 years from now and just port it right back. So the core, there's a few core pieces. One core piece is we believe in the power of entrepreneurship, and we want to support entrepreneurs. And how we do that, and in what vertical we do that, and the timing and structure around that might change over time, and has changed a little bit already since our inception. I'd say that it's evolved more than changed, but that's a big North Star. Another big North Star is that we are interested in playing long-term games with long-term people. And that means that we are frequently doing things, taking our time where there's no monetary incentive. And I mean, in a lot of ways, because there's another book, a really great resource called Power Law. So much of early stage investing and tech, it's an incredible book. If you read that book, you're going to know 70% of the stories of venture capital that are generally relevant. And it's the genesis of the industry into the modern era. The way that this business really works is that we are trying to find entrepreneurs who have really big visions about how the future might look, and it is going to take a lot of effort for them to change the present into the future. And we want to be along for that journey. And it might mean we talk to them 3 or 4 or 5 times, and there's no transaction. It's just a conversation. And if they call the 6th and the 7th and the 8th time, we pick up the phone every time. And again, that's about a relationship. And
sure.
It's totally about, again, the community aspect and being willing to take this, and it is a luxury to be able to take a long-term vision to supporting entrepreneurs and being involved in the ecosystem separate from transactions.
I think that's very interesting. And in 5 years, I'm going to have to call you and ask you again, because I think that you're right. Like it is something that evolves. And I think that there's something helpful to thinking about it that way, and thinking about it as something that can evolve and should evolve, really, if someone is being, intentional about trying to stay up on trends, right? It should evolve.
And Rebecca, to one of your earliest questions, no, when I was in the National Park Service, I had no idea I'd be doing this. But I also, at that point in time, didn't really know, even when I was at Datadog, I didn't know I'd be doing this. And so I refer to this idea of cascading opportunity, where one thing goes and then it opens up 10. But I actually couldn't see any of the 10 until that first one happens. And so, look, there are people who you can talk to who have lines of sight through very specific things over a long period of time. The founders of Datadog are folks like that. I think about Howard Marks, who's an incredible investor, person like that. There's many examples to draw on there. That is not how I function related to opportunity and what's happened. So again, just a different approach. If you're like me when you were in college and you're totally overwhelmed by which thing can happen and how it'll happen, I'm not sitting here saying I had the foresight back then. So
I think that's tremendously helpful for students to hear, honestly, because sometimes 10 years down the road you can create sort of the linear narrative and begin to even imagine that you did have some sense that it was all going to kind of go in this step-by-step format, but we know it's much messier than that. It always is. And so I love that you present this other model of just thinking about sort of, like you said, 18 months or 24 months and thinking about growth as sort of the model that you follow. It's another model that I think is much more comfortable in this modern world with so many changes and so many industries in such upheaval. Let me ask you one more question, and then we've got some audience questions that I want to transition to. But the last question that I want to ask is, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges facing startup founders in 2023?
Wow, biggest challenges facing startup founders. Interest rates came down. Interest rates went up. So the forward value of earnings and revenue came down dramatically as a multiple. Another WashU grad named Ben Hoven just wrote about this. He tweeted it. I can send it along afterwards so people can reach out to me. A lot of people have written about it and talked about it. And let me zoom out. The hardest thing right now is raising money. So if you have an idea and you can get customers pretty early on and get revenue pretty early on, I think the challenges that face you in 2023 are the challenges that'll face you at any point in time in a startup journey, which is going to be hiring and competitors. So if you have a product that can get customers and get revenue and do it in a relatively quick way, and you've got a strong founding team, those two, hiring and those are always going to be. It's not 2023 specific. 2023 specific, it's a very hard environment to fundraise. So entrepreneurs who are thinking about trying to raise venture capital right now, be forewarned, it has to do with macro conditions and the impact as it flows all the way from the public markets down to the seed stage. So happy to say more of that Q&A, or people can reach out directly, but I'd say that's the hardest thing that's specific to this year.
That's great. Let me transition. We got a question from an audience member. It's an MBA student. They said they have an idea for a product that could solve multiple company problems, and they're curious if there's any classes that you would suggest they take that could help them with moving forward with a venture, if that's something they want to do after graduation. Any classes you would suggest?
Yeah. No hard feelings to WashU. I'm sure there are awesome classes. I am not familiar with the course offerings. And so if you send me some, I can look at it. But I think that your question might have two parts. One is on the actual raising capital, starting a startup side. I think some of the resources I mentioned, Venture Deals by Brad Feld, Power Law, I'm embarrassed, I forget this guy's name. A few other books like that can get you a lot of information pretty quickly. But what I'd actually do if I was this person is I would find other entrepreneurs who are further along in the journey and ask them what they did, and do it in a conversational matter. I would not assign you homework or another course. I would just say, go have coffee with 10 entrepreneurs who you think might have walked a similar path. And if you're having trouble finding those people, reach out to me. We can do the first conversation. Even if I'm not that right person, I can probably point you to someone else.
Thank you. Someone else asked, there are a lot of changes in the field of cloud, AI, and analytics. A lot of tasks and metrics and IT products are done by FANG firms. And so how can startups and venture capitalists contribute and compete with those larger firms?
I don't see venture capitalists competing with them. And those areas are huge differentiated areas. The framework I want to give here is to always look for bedrock structure. And what I mean by that is, with the proliferation of tools and tooling around those very different areas, cloud, analytics, AI, there are going to be so many tools that spring up. But look for what is bedrock value, what is the thing that people are using that they can't go without. I'll give an example from the data monitoring space. I think it's something that Datadog got right. Datadog had a lot of competitors in the early days, and then only had two others, Splunk and New Relic, that were both publicly traded before Datadog. And Splunk's base unit of measure was logging, and New Relic's was APM, application performance monitoring, and Datadog started with infrastructure. And it turns out that infrastructure was the right bedrock layer. The other two companies still exist, and they have some things they do incredibly well and are hard to replace. By the way, I haven't worked at Datadog in 5 years, so this is not any kind of financial guidance, to be clear. It's just understanding where these things sit in the ecosystem stack, and then trying to figure out how you want to be involved with those. So
I love it. We got another good question. We haven't touched much on this. You mentioned you have partners that you founded Zag Capital with. I'm curious, and the question is, what kind of partners in general should a founder look for to help lift their startup company from the ground? So you could perhaps talk about how you chose the founding team, or just general advice for other people as they're getting started.
Yeah, Zag Capital, as an investing entity, I don't think it's going to be as fitting here. So let me talk about what we see. Sure. and what we've seen be successful. Number one, someone you work incredibly well with. Number two, someone who you feel very comfortable having hard conversations with. Those two things can be different. And part of this is a clear delineation of responsibilities. So the classic is a technical person and a business person, and you put them together and you know who owns what, and they do the thing. There are a number of iterations on this. One of the issues I see out of entrepreneurship, out of academia specifically, this is not WashU specific, but academia generally, I mean, too many founders. If there are 4 people on a founding team, 2 of them are going to do the work, maybe 3. So I've met a number of MBA teams, there are 4 people, and by the way, I have no problem giving hard feedback. And I very politely say, when you 4 have figured out which 2 of you actually want to run this business, let's talk again. And there are a number of public examples of this. I think General Assembly had 4 founders. I think Warby Parker had 4 founders. I think I don't remember exactly which of these, but there are a number that I know of where they were a great idea and they did achieve success, and simultaneously the founding team that existed, after they got outside of the academic sphere was vastly different from within. So yeah, and having a co-founder. Look, if you're extraordinarily technical and you're also doing sales and you're like, I can be a solo founder, you're not wrong. I know some great solo founders. Find someone who can be your peer that you can talk to about anything on the business side, because the journey can be lonely. The successes can be lonely and the failures can be lonely. And on a day-to-day basis, a founder might think that they've got the world on a string, and they might be like, oh my God, the world's on fire. And you can hit both of those in the same day, in the same hour even. So it's really important to be able to talk with someone about that from a mental health aspect more than from the startup specific achievement aspect.
This kind of goes right into the next question from the audience. They said they would like to hear about some of the toughest phases that you faced, either in your career or when you delved into your startup. You mentioned a short phase in venture capital. I believe that was maybe the first 10 months, or it might have been after Datadog that it was in New York City. I think you mentioned a short phase there.
Yeah, in New York City.
And so, yeah, so it might be there, it might be earlier in your career, sort of when you were at some of your toughest phases. I'm curious, kind of share a little bit about that, or kind of how you pulled yourself up from that, or how you got.
I think that the through line I want to give for the tough phases is going to be that you have a belief in yourself that is not matched by reality at the time. And there is going to come a time where you prove that your vision was correct, or that you have to admit it was wrong. And I have been on both sides. And the feeling in the moment is the same. I'm not going to say which startup. When I left a startup, I'm not going to say which one for my career, but I was pulled into the room by the CEO, and they said, you're making a mistake by going to the next company. We can give you any role you want here. You should stay. But for me, it wasn't a part of my vision. And so I left. And that moment, despite whatever happened after, was really, really hard. And it turns out I made the right choice, but I don't hold that against the CEO, right? They're involved in keeping the people they think that are talented at their company. So it's a compliment.
Sure.
And simultaneously, it was a really hard moment. And on the other side of things, leaving a venture firm after 6 months, I thought it could be my forever job. I had a wrong image there, and I had to recognize the difference between the reality and the vision that I had, and go back to thinking about it differently. So look, it's very, very hard for a lot of people to oscillate like that, to be willing to step in or out of those spaces. If you find you're really, really good at it, you're probably going to be predisposed to working in entrepreneurial fashion, whether or not that's a startup or a small business or whatever it might be. So I think that would be what I say on hard phases.
I love it. Thank you. I'm curious, one last thing, and this is perhaps feels a little bit random, but I've been reading a little bit about sort of morning routines or rituals or things that like sort of people adopt that sort of keep them in a good place. I know you mentioned, just kind of how you emerged from these tough areas. I'm curious, do you have any, it might be mantras, it might be things you do kind of every morning or things you do every week or things that you have adopted that have become for you really important kind of anchors in your day, in your week, or in your life?
Yeah, there are a number of things, but I'd also say when you're living startup life, it's hard to maintain some of those routines, and you shouldn't beat yourself up if you're not doing all your routines perfectly. So for me, the two are just exercise and writing. And writing is writing not to share with anyone else. It's just to be able to get thoughts out. And there's structured ones you can read about. There's one from a book called Artist's Way called Morning Pages, where you try and write 3 pages uninterrupted first thing in the morning. I'm not as strict about it. I just want to try and write with a pen and paper at some point during the day about what's happening. So it helps me think in a more structured manner and also get certain thoughts out of the way. And then exercise. I run. I used to play a lot of basketball. I was excellent at WashU pickup and intramurals. But I play less basketball now. If I can surf, I want to surf. But really, running and yoga are 2 things that I do a lot of. Again, you could play pickleball, you could juggle, like whatever it is that's a physical thing is great. So those are the 2 that
several of my sophomore students have mentioned pickleball and interested in pickleball. So I think you're right. It's sort of taking campus by storm. So you got your finger on
the only problem with pickleball is supposedly it doesn't look good live TV. Otherwise, I mean, it could take over the NBA. We'll see. We'll see what happens.
That is so funny. I love it. Well, Ray, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been really fun for me to just be able to hear your thoughts on things, and just as a person, as a founder, I just think that you're a wonderful person for me and for the students and for colleagues to hear from. And so I really appreciate you being here today, and it's been a pleasure speaking with you, and I really appreciate the rich discussion. Before we go, I would like to introduce Carrie Donnelly from WashU's Olin Graduate Admissions Office, and Carrie's just going to share a few updates and close out the program.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Much. It's such an exciting time to be in the startup space. Ray, thank you again for your time today and for the many insights that you've shared. And Rebecca, thank you to you for facilitating this in-depth conversation. Entrepreneurial spirit is one of WashU Olin's pillars of excellence, and it's foundational to our MBA. An innovative outlook is an essential part of leadership, even for those who may not want to go on to be an entrepreneur or a venture capitalist. We invite you to join us for an upcoming virtual event, Beyond the MBA, Gain Your Competitive Edge. Our Career Center coaches and experts will discuss our top-rated graduate business programs for professionals, including our integrated career support for all types of careers. The virtual event is Tuesday, February 28th at 5 p.m. Central Time. To register, use the QR code on the screen now or the link being shared in the chat. We hope to see you there. Thank you for attending today's Leadership Perspectives event. Be sure to join us for our annual She Suite event on Wednesday, March 8th to celebrate International Women's Day. You won't want to miss hearing from our impressive panel of women leaders as they share their stories and provide insights and actionable takeaways on advancing women in the workplace. Again, use the QR code on your screen or the link in the chat to register. You won't want to miss it. Until next time, have a wonderful evening.